Hello, class. Here I am again in my dining room of my home, which is also my office. I'm here to talk about module number one, objectives 3 and 4. And this is our last video for module number 1. Without further ado, we will get started. Sharing my screen and getting that slideshow up. Okay, so objective 3 is to compare the 3 perspectives, current perspectives, on addiction and identify the advantages and disadvantages of each perspective. Here we go. Here are the 3 current perspectives on addiction. We've talked about immoral behavior. It's still around. Hint, hint. We still think that people who are addicted are criminal, or they've chosen bad things in their life. A disease perspective, which is very, very popular today, that people who have addiction are somehow diseased or vulnerable. And then finally, maladaptive behavior. And this one's been given less credit throughout history. And so we're going to introduce that now, which is the idea that, addictive behavior is a learned habit. We'll cover that in this objective as well. Okay, here's the deal with addiction. And I come back to that idea. Why do we need all these theories? We need all these theories because we want a simple cause. Why does this happen? And we want to be able to say, this is why it happens. Here's how to get rid of it. But none of that has worked. So we need more. We need a broader base of theory. And that's why a lot of this class is about theory. So addiction is really complex. We have to understand it as there are biological factors, there are things that are going on in the brain and in the body. There are psychological factors having to do with, I think we talked about in the trauma and poor learning and bad habits. There are also sociocultural factors. You may recognize this as a bio-psycho-social approach that you've talked about in other psychology classes. The social part is one we haven't really covered, which is the availability of drugs and alcohol, right? Poverty, just the situation of poverty, making it more likely that people will become addicted. Lack of education, lack of employment opportunities, racism, oppression, access to services being low. These are all things that increase addiction. But also on top of that, we have this sort of element of our culture being one of where capitalism is a dominant concept. So we have, for example, pharmaceutical companies that are pushing against regulation, and they're also pushing for the disease model because remember, they can make some money on providing medications for diseases and things like that. But also, if somebody becomes addicted, then you've got a surefire sale of your medicine. Cannabis companies are pushing for legalization everywhere. And we know that in Missouri, that legalization has already happened for recreational use and also medical use. State-sponsored lotteries. And eventually in this class, we'll talk about addiction to gambling, right? So we've got all of these other elements of society that are kind of pushing us in one direction or another. Okay, so addiction as an immoral behavior is the first perspective we're going to cover. And this is the idea that addiction is something that is freely chosen. I choose to do drugs. I choose to drink. It's a freely chosen behavior. It's a big FU to moral and ethical codes. It basically says, I don't care about your societal codes. I'm going to do this. The logical response to this kind of criminal or degenerate behavior is that you would punish. And that is largely what our society has done. And so we talk about the war on drugs, and this gives you some idea of what's been spent on the war on drugs, 52 years, now arguably even longer than that, and we'll argue that in a minute. There's been a ton of money spent on criminalizing addiction. And we'll come back to that many times. So let's talk about, again, today what's going on. It's really this idea that it's a moral affliction. It's a sin. It's a sin. It is a person who has just bucked all the standards of society and says, I'm just going to do things my way. Again, we punish in that case. And in 1986, we had the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, and that was started by Ronald Reagan. When Ronald Reagan was in office, it was increased money to fight drugs, and that meant law enforcement, and it meant criminalization of drug users. And also the zero tolerance for drugs was a predominant idea. There was a decrease in money at the time for treatment and research, but we had even seen that before. And it started with what I talked about last time with the Harrison Act, with prohibition, which is this idea of criminalizing drug use. The effects of these changes are still present. We still put a ton of money into law enforcement. And if you see, for example, this article that I've used the picture of here, this, it's 2023. We know that this stuff doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. We know the punishment doesn't work, but yet we still keep investing a lot of money into punishment. So addiction as immoral is alive and well in today's society. So let's look at the advantages and disadvantages. The advantage as a theory is that it's parsimonious. Parsimonious just means simple. It's easy to understand. It's logical. The person just makes a bad choice. They are freely choosing to do this, and they're doing something that is bad, that is sinful, that is wrong. It's absolute. There's no need for science. We already know what causes addiction. People make wrong choices. They just need to be punished. So, duh, the disadvantages. The evidence suggests that the etiology or the causes of addiction are way more complex than that. It's not just always freely chosen. There's some compulsive behavior that happens with addiction. And so if you're addicted to something, then you know that. Full disclosure, I am addicted to Nicorette gum, used to be a smoker, but I can tell you that if it was my free choice, I would not have a piece of gum in my mouth right now, but sometimes it feels a little compulsive, like I got to put one in. Okay, anyway, there it is. Okay, the punishment basically has been ineffective at reducing addiction. And even, the punishment, what happens with punishment is that then we withdraw treatment resources and things like that. And we get increases in addiction rather than the decreases that we want out of this. So those are some pretty big disadvantages of it. But we see it over and over again. We see it in society, for example, in many different places, like in medicine, we see restriction of liver transplants, where people who were alcohol users are on the bottom of the list if their liver goes bad, because they said they're not seen as worthy of a liver transplant and things like that. So it's all over the place. Okay, let's turn to our second perspective, addiction as a disease. This is the idea that addiction is an attribute of the person, not the drug. I am susceptible to nicotine addiction, okay? But it's not that nicotine is bad, because you may do nicotine. If you probably chewed a piece of nicotine gum, you'd probably want to throw up, but I love it. There's a biological predisposition. It can be, for example, genetic, that causes problematic use, right? There's a loss of control rather than a free choice, as I was explaining. I don't really feel like I have an entirely free choice. Although sometimes I do choose, or I perceive it that way. Users should receive compassionate care. They're victims of a disease. So, you should get some care for that. If I had cancer, you'd treat me nicely, as opposed to, being addicted to heroin, for example. If we think about it as a disease, we treat people a little bit nicer. Okay, so what are the advantages and disadvantages of that? Well, one of them is compassionate care. Society being more willing to, as society goes in and out of the idea that addiction is a disease, they're more willing to give resources. They're more willing to make treatment programs and things like that. That's helped a lot of people with recovery. And I think I talked about that with regard to Alcoholics Anonymous. Alcoholics Anonymous had this concept that you should receive compassionate care, but there are many other groups that took the moral perspective. For example, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, their concept is we need to have harsher punishments, we need to have mandatory sentences, da 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 da, right? So this concept of compassionate care really goes along with addiction as a disease. But there are some disadvantages also. Okay, some of the concepts, like this idea of loss of control, doesn't always hold up in the research. What we find is that under certain circumstances, people seem to have more control than in other circumstances. So maybe it's not a total loss of control, right? Also, there's an idea that abstinence is the only way for, if a person is addicted, you've got to be abstinent. You've got to get off of the drug entirely, never use the drug again. And in fact, it looks like there are some moderation programs that work. Moderation has been used a lot more in other countries. Programs based on moderation or cutting down or making it less of a heavy use situation, used a lot more in other countries, but here in the United States, we've really focused on abstinence. Well, these concepts have been scientifically challenged. So this idea that you need abstinence or that it's always a loss of control, no, that's not always been true in the science. The other thing is that the biological cause hasn't been pinpointed. It's not like you can say, oh, this is the gene for alcoholism. Here's the gene here for heroin use. So we really don't know that much about it. It has a lot to do with neurotransmitters. I think we'll talk about it in this class. On top of that, there's money to be made in taking on this disease perspective. So we have these advocates of the disease perspective. For example, the alcohol industry, the cannabis industry. The idea here is that cannabis is not the problem. Alcohol is not the problem. It's the person. And they love that in the industry because my drug is just fine. It's the person with the problem. Pharmaceutical companies are real big into this disease idea because then they can say, well, we need to develop drugs to beat this disease, and that allows us to, because of the concept is that you would medically treat, so we'll develop some drugs to treat, and they've been very successful in doing so. Providers of all types, physicians, nurses, psychologists, social workers, it helps to call it a disease, because if you call it a disease, then you can bill insurance companies for your services. So there's a lot of this kind of influence of here's these people that are trying to make money. And so a lot of the spread of the disease concept has to do with, there's money involved. Okay, so let's go into our last perspective here. As addiction as a maladaptive behavior, meaning an unhealthy, a harmful behavior that one has developed. Okay, it's not a sinful behavior. It's kind of like we're just suspending judgment. There's no judgment of this behavior. It's just a behavior that someone has developed. It's also not totally out of control because you developed a habit, and that habit can be changed, right? Even if it influences one's brain. So doing this habit influences the chemicals in our brain and influences the way the brains work, and we'll talk about that eventually in this class. But that doesn't mean you can't influence it in another direction. So it is also heavily influenced by society and environmental factors, challenging circumstances, places where, we've got poverty and accessibility issues and cost issues and all of that kind of stuff. So these are challenging circumstances for a person. The treatment, in terms of the treatment, is that you change behavior. You do some different learning. So you learned this habit, and now we're going to unlearn this habit. We're going to learn other habits, and that requires modifying one's lifestyle and changing the conditions and changing, for example, your social environment, your physical environment, things like that. So, so let's talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of the addiction as maladaptive behavior perspective. So one advantage is it's really broad. It considers psychological factors. It considers biological factors. It considers social aspects of addiction, which we'll talk about in this class. On top of that, prevention and treatment really do work. So we can do prevention, for example, with school-based interventions. And I know you're all thinking about DARE, but DARE wasn't really successful, and we'll talk about that in this class. But there are interventions that were successful, right? Or that have been successful, and they do work to prevent people from becoming addicted to alcohol and drugs. Treatment also works. So we can modify these habits. And so that's great, you know. In fact, for every 10% increase in spending on treatment, we see a 2% decrease in loss of life because of alcohol and drug related causes. So we do see treatment really does work. And treatment may be to what we call changing the contingencies for drug use. And we'll talk about that again in this class. Disadvantages: lack of public support or knowledge about this broad basis of causality. Also, some of the conditions that you need to change to be able to prevent the drug addiction, are things like changing poverty. Good luck with that, right? It's expensive. This is huge. This is broad, right? On top of that, the funding is really low for these kinds of changes because we put all our money in law enforcement, right? Because we're kind of still operating back in the dark ages in some ways. Because remember, that law enforcement criminalization has to do with that immoral perspective. So there's not a lot of money for this kind of perspective. Okay, so let's review these. The immoral perspective is this idea that addiction is a sin. It's an immoral behavior. It's done by an individual's free will. I choose to be sinful. I'm regarded as a criminal because of that, degenerate. And so it makes sense that I should be punished. I should be arrested. I should have fines. And there we get the war on drugs, right? The disease perspective says that it's a predisposed condition, that I am somehow flawed. I have a disease. I have a genetic predisposition that makes me susceptible, right? It's a biological influence, right? This idea that I can't even control it because I've got this disease. I'm a victim. Therefore, I should be treated compassionately, and that the treatment should be medical-based approaches, right? So medicine could help me. The maladaptive behavior is the concept that addiction is a learned behavior. It's a biopsychosocial cause. There's biological things that happen in the brain. There's psychological things with regard to learning and learning habits. There's also social things, environmental challenging conditions that make me more likely to get an addiction in certain conditions. People are victims. Again, they're victims of living and learning conditions, high crime areas, childhood trauma, etc. And public health interventions and psychological interventions are what's going to be successful there. And we'll talk a little bit about contingency management, creating a set of rewards and punishments that influence addictive behavior. And we'll talk about relapse prevention. It's a psychological intervention. Okay, so we are on our final objective for the chapter, objective 4. We're going to talk about DSM-5 diagnosis of substance use disorder and identify some appropriate language for talking about substance abuse in this class, substance use. Okay, DSM-5. The DSM-5 diagnostic criteria I have on the screen here, there's 11 criteria, but I'm going to kind of sum it up. items 1 through 4 have to do with lack of control. Now, you don't have to have that lack of control. It doesn't have to be present in order to be diagnosed. Now, you just have to have more than two or more of the following of these within a 12-month period. Okay. So if you don't have lack of control items, then maybe you have social impairment or consequences items. Those are items 5 through 7. And you may have one of 1 through 4 and one of 5 through 7, and that would be enough. So take a look at those. Those are things like, there's consequences to your life, and it's kind of screwing up your life in some ways. Risky use of substances, those are items 8 and 9, and that is, for example, physical hazards that you get involved in, maybe car accidents and stuff like that. You're doing things that are risky. And then finally, pharmacological symptoms. And those are things like tolerance and withdrawal. And those are items 10 and 11. So pause here and take a look at some of those items and how they relate. Now, I want you to remember that tolerance and withdrawal, for example, you don't necessarily have to have, because you don't have to have all 11 of these items. Remember, just 2 or more. So how does that work? Well, it works in terms of severity. So the severity of the disorder depends on how many of these 11 items you have. So a mild severity of substance use disorder would be 2 to 3 items. Moderate would be 4 to 5 items. And severe would be 6 or more items. And so we also classify, so there's a bunch of sort of sub-classifications, for example, depending on what substance you are using. So we have, for example, alcohol use disorder, opioid use disorder, cannabis use disorder, and all of these different substances are named. There's also other unknown substances you can see at the bottom there. But I want you to note here that the behavioral addiction, we'll talk about one in this class and possible other ones for the future of the DSM, but the only one that's really recognized in the DSM right now is gambling. And so gambling disorder is classified elsewhere. It is not a substance use disorder because it is not a substance that you're ingesting. Okay. And so these are all possible types of substance use disorders. Okay, want to make a quick note on language and appropriate language. And this is current language standards. And you're going to see in some of the readings and elsewhere that this has changed relatively rapidly, language. And so we're moving toward a more non-biased language in talk about addictions, but people still make a lot of mistakes, and you may definitely see me make mistakes as well. Okay, what is the influence on changing the language? The influence on changing the language is studies like this one. And what this study did is it created a story of a person with substance use disorder. And then in the story, they had 2 versions of it. It's the same exact story. Okay, but there were 2 versions of it. In one, the person is called a substance abuser. In another version of the same exact story, because the same stuff happens in the story, is the person is described as having a substance use disorder. 2 different ways of using the language, right? It turns out that when professionals, and I'm talking about professionals who are in the treatment business, who saw a substance abuser in that group, they were more likely to think that the person was personally responsible, had some agency, had a choice, and chose the wrong thing, kind of thing, where we go back to that immoral thing. And they were more likely to recommend punishment. And so getting away from that, we're trying to use more non-biased language, like having a substance use disorder, for example, instead of saying substance abuser, which again sounds like the person has agency there, has a lot of agency. So let's talk a little bit more about some of these terms. We don't use the word abuser. We try to use the word use instead of abuse. So a person suffers from an addiction or suffers from a substance use disorder, not a substance abuser. Okay. And it's better than to identify a person. You can talk about addiction, person who suffers from addiction, but this is a person who suffers from addiction. This is not an addict, an alcoholic, an abuser. It is a person. So that first person language is identifying as a person instead of identifying in a category. In terms of the drug, you're going to want to say a medication or a non-medically used psychoactive substance. And that's just to indicate, just to be more specific and avoid the confusion having to do with what's legal, illegal, and things like that, because there are many, many addictive substances that are illegal. Clean and dirty had a kind of moral component to it. So the first person is clean, and it used to be in the old days, it was wet or dry, right? Clean and dirty. A person's been clean for 2 months or something like that. It's not clean or dirty, right? It is that they have had negative test results, okay? The lapse, the relapse, the slip, we're changing that kind of language now so the person resumed. And again, this has to do with the concept of agency there. So you're probably going to hear lots of mistakes in this area, but it's something to aspire to. We're changing the language. Okay, let's go with some take-home points for Module 1 as a whole module. Addiction is complex. It requires a range of theoretical perspectives. We've got to have the bio, we got to have the psycho, and we got to have the social. And that means that we're going to cover a lot of theories, right? And history is really influencing how we understand addiction today. And the two big historical perspectives are the immoral perspective and the disease perspective. There are treatments that work. There are good treatments out there that work, but we're not always putting them into place because there are a lot of political and social and historical issues that influence the way that we treat people who have addiction problems. The language can be stigmatizing, so we've got to be careful with the language about addiction. And with that, I will end my lecture for Module 1. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you again on Module 2. Bye-bye.